Welcome back to Coffee and Clarity, Preventing Substance Misuse. My name is Raina Jewell, and this is Ava Winter. In this episode, we are chatting with Molly Schmidtke, who works for the Association for Nonsmokers, Minnesota. She is really knowledgeable about public health and is here to talk about how tobacco products affect the environment.
Can you explain the environmental impact of tobacco products?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. The best way I can start it off with that question is that there's a huge impact, and in a lot of different ways, depending on which, commercial tobacco product you're talking about or what product you're looking at. So with combustible cigarettes, the impact is detrimental. We see a lot of deforestation caused from the farming of these products, from the manufacturing of these products. Approximately 600 million trees are cut down each year for combustible cigarettes. So huge impacts there. Increased water consumption as well throughout the whole process of making a cigarette. And then also with greenhouse gas emissions and toxic chemicals coming out from the manufacturing side. With vapes, this is kind of a newer up-and-coming thing that's been researched within the last 10-ish years. But there's a lot of environmental impacts that come from the e-cigarettes, the vapes as well. So nicotine is considered acute hazardous waste by the EPA, and has been for 20 plus years. So that is hazardous to our environment. There's also other volatile organic compounds found inside a vape. There's ultrafine particles, there's heavy metals like nickel and lead, and then the flavorings as well, they can be toxic to our environment. And then the last piece I kind of wanted to add to this would be that the lithium batteries themselves are hazardous waste, and they increase a lot of electronic waste in our communities.
How does tobacco contribute to the changes in the environment?
Yeah, so I started to touch on this a little bit. So obviously, deforestation is a huge piece. That is a huge change in our environment. It also contributes to the desertification of farming land as well. It's harder to plant other crops in areas that were previously farmed for tobacco. It also touched on the greenhouse gas emissions. We see that from secondhand smoke. We see that from the production and consumption of tobacco. The release of CO2 into our environment is equivalent to driving about 17 million gas-powered cars each year. So that's a huge impact on CO2 emissions coming from just the production and consumption of these products. Pollution is a huge issue. Cigarette butts are one of the most littered products in the world, in the nation, in Minnesota. So that has a big impact as well, just on, changes in the environment. And then I kind of said again with vapes too, but the mining of these products, cobalt mining and lithium mining, that has a very a big impact on, changes in the environment. There's a lot of ethical issues that go into the mining of some of these precious metals and precious resources. So that is a huge, huge issue. Obviously, then with all these vapes, they're non-biodegradable. Neither are cigarette butts or cigarettes, but with the vapes, they all turn into microplastics. It takes a really long time for them to go away. They're going to just be staying in our environment for a really long time. I kind of like to think of like the lifestyle, or not lifestyle, sorry. Kind of like the circle of life for tobacco products, for commercial tobacco products. So tobacco burning, that kind of first part of like during the growing, curing, and manufacturing process increases those greenhouse gas levels by generating air pollutants and high levels of water consumption. Again, the deforestation, that those practices to continue to grow tobacco it is responsible for about 5% of the world's deforestation. Toxic chemicals released into the environment, almost 720,000 pounds of toxic chemicals released each year just in U.S. tobacco facilities. And then the use of water. We don't necessarily think of the water consumption piece. Tobacco growth uses 22 billion tons of water each year, which is a lot of water. That's a huge resource that could be going elsewhere. So when we think about that much water consumption going into the growing of these products, it has that really big impact. And all of this is right from the tobacco industries because they continue to make these kinds of products.
Could you tell us about the toolkit developed to address the environmental impact of tobacco products?
Absolutely. So this was kind of something that myself and a couple of colleagues over at Answer had been talking about, being like, there's a lot of crossover, there's a lot of overlap. We talk a lot about, mental health and nicotine, and we talk a lot about tobacco industry targeting. Both of those things are huge, right? Like, absolutely needs to be talked about. I felt like this was another kind of pillar that needed to be added to that conversation. So we really dug in. This is actually, I did this toolkit for my master's project while I was getting my master's in public health. So it's kind of nice to be able to do work and school at the same time for this kind of project. But we really wanted to create a toolkit as well as create like youth curriculum with our Tobacco 101 curriculum that we offer. That's specifically used for training youth on this issue. We have like 11 chapters in that curriculum, and this one is one of the most popular chapters among the youth groups that I've worked with and have done the trainings with. We just felt like, the resources were really kind of spread out, like they weren't all in one place. And so that was really what we wanted to do. We wanted to make this free toolkit for people who are looking for information. We had received a lot of requests across the state for information about this. Schools being like, how can I dispose of these products? What am I supposed to do with this? Student groups being like, how is this impacting things? So making sure that we had kind of a landing spot for people to be able to explore all of these issues, and we continue to grow it, right? The toolkit's never a finalized thing. There's always more information coming out. So we continue to update it as, we create new materials to add to it.
What strategies are effective in educating people about the environmental impact of tobacco use?
Yeah. So again, I feel like this is relatively not, at least with vapes, it's a relatively new problem because vapes are relatively new. They're not that old. But I think overall, the first thing is just not a lot of individuals know how harmful the impact can be. So really sharing out information is critical. As a baseline, getting that education piece up. So, and another thing too, obviously, in the public health and prevention space regarding commercial tobacco, it's always important to connect it back to public health. Emphasize how environmental degradation exacerbates health issues already associated with smoking. All of those things, polluted air can exacerbate respiratory diseases and cancer and asthma, which are all things that are like disproportionately impacted by commercial tobacco use. So really connecting it back to public health is really a huge thing. Partnering with youth. Youth are the best messengers when it comes to, anything. Doesn't have to be commercial tobacco related, but having youth on your side and having youth lead some of this work as well, it's super important, and that is super effective in kind of getting messages across, getting people, not necessarily on board, but like with you in the cause. And then another piece too is just the waste generation of the products. That tends to be a big talking point as well, of like, what does this look like in the grand scheme of things? What does this look like for our state? What's the collection? So talking about that as well when sharing out can be really effective.
How do restrictions on flavored tobacco products help reduce environmental damage?
Yeah, so there's a lot. Overall, just having less products in our environment equals less opportunity for pollution, for the pollution of these products, right? So, um, it's not necessarily going to stop, some of the front hand sides of it that we know are harmful to the environment, but we know that we can be reactive. And one of the, benefits that comes from passing policy is just, less pollution. Flavored vapes have harmful chemicals, like I said, in the flavoring. Everything just goes back to pollution. Even with menthol, there was a really great study that came out of Canada, and we have we worked with the researcher to gather the data of what a menthol ban would look like. What would that impact be on the environment? So Canada passed this bill. They've been studying the impact, and we wanted to see, what would that impact be in the U.S. So a proposed menthol ban in the U.S. would cut littering by 3.8 billion cigarette butts annually. So that would be reducing waste by 1.7 million pounds each year. So that is a huge piece, and that's only with menthol cigarettes, right? So there's huge impacts when it comes to passing policy around these kinds of products. Not only obviously reducing, appeal and accessibility of these products, but also reducing the harm that it's going to be doing on the environment, on kind of the back end of things.
What have you learned from working with youth on vaping surveys and advocacy work?
Yeah, I kind of touched on this before as well, but youth are the best messengers. Partnering with youth is a super powerful tool. There's more trust when information is coming peer to peer. Peer to peer advocacy mobilizes young people a lot quicker than what any adult really could. Young people have access to data collection. Better data collection even sometimes than what public health might. For example, convenience surveying is a really great tool to get a good lay of the land on the issue. We've done some convenience surveying up in the metro area, and youth can really run with this. They can get that data collection that, some of us would not be able to do. We're not necessarily the trusted messenger when it comes to, fill out this survey about your vaping habits or whatever the topic might be. You're going to get much more truthful answers when it's coming from a peer compared to a teacher or, someone at public health or a stranger. So youth their ability to be able to collect unique data is absolutely needed in these partnerships between young people and public health.
Kind of adding on to that, how can our youth groups include environmental concerns in our tobacco prevention efforts?
Yeah, so it goes back to that idea of adding this in as a pillar, right? Like we talk about, tobacco industry targeting and marketing. There's a long history of the commercial tobacco industry targeting different populations in the U.S. The industry does a ton of greenwashing and covers up their products' harms. And it's really interesting in those same documents that came out from the Master Settlement Agreement back in the 90s, they found environmental pieces as well. Not only did they find all of these marketing and targeting strategies that the tobacco industry employed, but they also employed environmental strategies on opposing legislation that might impact the sale of cigarettes. There were even documents in there that explicitly said, these aren't going to degrade, but that's not our problem. So we see those documents as well. They're in there. So kind of adding it as a pillar in those discussions is so important when educating peers, educating decision makers, appeal to what they're interested in. We've met with some decision makers that are very environmentally focused, and this can be a really big motivator for them of like, I did not know the impact that these products have on the environment. This is going to, take me into doing some more action. So really just, becoming a pillar in our messaging, having environmental harms messaging along with everything else is a huge thing, and being able to educate out.
What steps can communities take to advocate for policies that decrease the environmental impact of tobacco?
Yeah, so there's a few different options. There's educational campaigns to raise awareness. Like I said earlier, kind of just before, there's not a lot of knowledge about this. So increasing knowledge base for everyone is super important. Passing, comprehensive smoking restrictions, so like a parks policy, that can be really important too. Less litter happening in the parks. Doing single-use plastic regulation, so that could include cigarette filters and lithium battery vapes. Passing hazardous waste laws, that would include both of those as well, since nicotine is considered hazardous waste. And then obviously a really big one is the sales restriction. So less access to the products, less likely that it's going to be littered, and that can be obviously at the state, local, federal level. But working on some of those flavor policies as well can really decrease that environmental impact.
What are some practical steps individuals can take to reduce the environmental impact of tobacco use?
Yeah, so I think for combustible cigarettes, one thing would be, if you smoke cigarettes, not littering your cigarette butts would be huge. Cleaning up your butts. It's about 47% of individuals who smoke end up littering their cigarette butts. So that would have a huge impact. Almost 50% would be less. There would be less litter there. If you vape, you have to take it to a hazardous waste facility for it to be properly disposed, rather than throwing them in the garbage, in the recycling, or littering them. So taking them to the proper disposal places, at the end of life, so to speak, is important on, those are practical steps that everyone can take on the back end. And then again, going back to the educational campaigns to raise awareness, all of those have a good impact. They make a difference in this work.
Are there any new strategies used in tobacco prevention that have an environmental focus?
Yeah, so I would say obviously tying commercial tobacco and climate change awareness together, having those two talked about together is newer. Even talking about waste and public health is newer. Those partnerships are starting to form. I think there's a bill actually at our legislature this year that is talking all about e-waste strategies. So essentially, a component of this bill would be that any vapes that have like gluten batteries, they wouldn't be able to be sold anymore on the market. So obviously that's just a subset of all of the commercial tobacco products that we encounter daily. But doing legislation around the e-waste piece and the hazardous waste piece, those are newer strategies and different strategies than what we've seen previously.
Okay, last question for you, Molly. What do you see for the future tobacco prevention efforts when it comes to including the environmental side of things?
Well, I touched on this in the last question, but definitely more collaboration with public health and environmental groups. There's a lot of overlap in climate and public health, and then obviously partnering with youth and young adults. They're huge drivers in the climate movement. So pairing commercial tobacco messaging with that can be really powerful, and I'm hopeful for the future on more of those partnerships. I think that, making sure that this becomes that pillar in our talking points is super important. The more people hear it, the more they're just going to, it's going to resonate. They're going to recognize it. It's not going to be, this new thing, but just something that we always are talking about as part of our messaging. And then I think the other thing too would be, continuing to expose the greenwashing tactics that the tobacco industry uses. They send out many different promotions around the environment, especially with Earth Day coming up. Some of the tobacco companies will send ads being like, oh, plant a tree today. Well, me planting one tree does not, really have that impact the way that the tobacco industry has by chopping down 600 million trees each year. Me planting one tree does not, equate to that kind of change. So continuing to look at those greenwashing tactics and really exposing that, because we're continuing to see it more and more as public health and commercial tobacco prevention people. We're starting to talk about this more, but so is the industry. They see where this is going. They're seeing where the changes are happening. And they're going more environmental, so to speak, in their kind of messaging as well. So really combating that, exposing that for what it is something that I really think we're going to be ramping up and doing more of in the future of, this space and around tobacco prevention and environmental harms.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to give a big thanks to Molly for sharing her knowledge on the environmental impact of commercial tobacco products. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed the episode.